Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Amita Bhide from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and this is a module on participation as a strategy and as part of the paper on community organization. We've tried to understand multiple concepts of participation, approaches to participation. We've also thought through dynamics of participation in terms of why, how, and what could be the forms of participation itself. But yet, there is one more step that we have not taken, that as a professional, it is very, very important to think through some ways in advance, but also being prepared for the dynamism in terms of that to be ready for the participatory process, there have to be certain things which need to be built in to the program itself. And we are going to be basically discussing these strategic aspects of the program today and in this module. So one of these is how do you plan for outreach. The second is in terms of how do you build capacities for participation. And the third challenge that one needs to really think through strategically is how does one institutionalize participation. So planning for outreach really occurs at an initial stage in some ways. And I think obviously this necessitates, even before thinking about how do you think about outreach, that why is a particular organization, a particular project thinking about adopting participation as a principle, how do we define the scope of participation is a very necessary thing, but that is not everything. So in terms of planning for outreach, what obviously it means is that outreach is what defines participation. It makes participation happen. So in some ways, it is the foundation of participation. Okay? So you need to plan for it both as an ongoing activity. You need to also think of it as a periodic activity through the life of a project. You need to also think of communication and constantly thinking about how to outreach via different kinds of media. The second aspect of it is thinking about some component of a physical presence. And when I'm talking about physical presence, it may be the presence of particular people, or it may be the presence of particular structures as well. This is where you kind of get together, this is where becomes the space of outreach, which has to be accessible. And obviously in all of this, the form of outreach, the mode of outreach, the timing of outreach, and the politics of outreach really matter. I will elaborate on each of these as we go forward. But I think even here, as a cautionary note, what we may think of is any outreach, if you don't seriously think through outreach and think of outreach as really stage focused, event focused, it may really help to smoothen out what you think are the initial hiccups. But on the other hand, it may alienate most of the people whom you actually want to be your partners and your participants. So there are different modes, and as I go forward, I will try to elaborate for you how different modes of outreach have actually been thought of. One of the commonest ways of thinking about outreach has been through deployment of field workers. And this really answers the question of who outreaches the community, who engages the community, and you answer that in the form of field workers. So you need to have definitely some format and some persons perhaps who are there in the community, right? And it has and it can take multiple kind of forms. So what are some of these, and what kind of lessons do we learn from these different mechanisms which have been used? So one common form has been to engage a cadre of workers who are drawn from the community and who really serve as the front line of any program. One good example of this is the Anganwadi workers, who are the frontline workers for the integrated child development scheme. Or we may think of the community health volunteers, who are the frontline workers for the integrated health programs, rural health programs in our country. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using this kind of cadre of workers? The advantage is obviously that these are people who are drawn from the community itself, and therefore they are able to reach out to people in their own language, in their own cultures, in their own forms, and that's a very, very important advantage. It is also then familiarizing and rooting the program in that local context. Okay, and any organization, any project becomes privy to that kind of knowledge which can come from the frontline workers. That's another advantage. On the disadvantage side, what is often very likely to happen and can happen really in some of these cases is basically that the minute you deploy these as frontline workers, they become representatives of the organization much more than they become representatives of the community. And in some ways, their link to the community gets disturbed. And this then is quite a bit of a problematic, and therefore retaining this kind of a balance between frontline workers acting as representatives of community versus acting as representatives of organizations or projects is something which is a thin line which needs to be always trod. The second way perhaps is by engaging trained extension workers. Now, extension workers do not face this kind of a dilemma of whether you are based in the community or whether you are based with the organization. These are very clearly extension workers of the organization itself or employed by the project itself. And there are multiple efficiencies perhaps because they are well trained, they are able to speak to the organization and give it what it wants in much more efficient terms. But on the other hand, these kind of people may also face a challenge in terms of acculturation in the community because they are distant from the community. One example of this is all over the country today, we have extension workers in the form of Gram Sevaks. And Gram Sevaks are graduates who are trained by the government organization and who take development programs to villages. But the disadvantage has been that they are now so rooted in the entire bureaucratic machinery that very rarely do villagers see them as their own. Okay, so this is one big disadvantage of engaging trained extension workers. A third form may be that you engage community-based organizations themselves. Okay, and so now you are going the other way. So if cadre of work, field workers was like a midway thing, partly balancing community, partly balancing organization. Trained extension workers are tilted much more towards the organization. This third form is tilted much more towards the community. So you are directly engaging community-based organizations who are representing some local initiative, leadership. The challenge of these is some of the CBOs may represent only a segment of the community and they may be a barrier to a larger outreach because now you have kind of engaged this segment. It is that segment which also tries to corner a whole lot of things, or things also get associated culturally with a particular group and therefore becomes inimical to others. There are some other strategies also. For example, there are specialist institutions sometimes and you entrust an entire outreach program and the overall participatory component to NGOs or to perhaps specialists like consultants. And this is often again a strategy which is used by international organizations and development organizations. And in these cases also there has to be some thinking through, because NGOs do bring with them a whole lot of soft skills, they do bring with them a whole lot of programmatic skills, but we need to recognize that always participation has to be seen and introduced as something which is rooted within local cultures. One cannot always assume that participation is only a skill set which can be kind of brought in neutrally by any actor. So the consideration of which NGO, why a particular actor, has to be preceded by an understanding of the local dynamics and the overall context of participation. And this is very, very critical. We have seen in certain large programs that what has tended to happen is some NGOs who have been extremely successful in certain contexts, but when the program has been scaled up and applied to many other contexts, the engagement of the NGO has not been so successful. In fact, they are also then perceived as outsiders rather than the forms of participation be locally accepted. The next dimension really of outreach is that whatever you may talk of, whether there are field workers or whether you engage CBOs or whoever, basically at a larger level where projects need to balance the technical with the social, because what you're bringing into the project through participation is really a social dimension, a processual dimension, a much more dynamic dimension which would go along with all that is technical and coming from top. Okay? But herein then this also becomes the site of struggle. Very, very frequently projects are seen really as technical, and the role of the social is seen as justifying the technical. So social becomes an entry point, whereas the technical is seen to be the real project in some ways. And when these kind of issues, and these get reflected in multiple ways. For example, you may basically value the technical people and personnel in a project much more than those who are linked with the community. For example, in sanitation programs, in water programs, you may value and place the engineers on top while locating the community practitioners and those who are linked with the community in a much smaller space, lesser in terms of the hierarchy. And this creates, I think, an imbalance, a lopsidedness in the team and its worldview, because they lose out on local knowledge, and obviously there are reduced spaces of participation. This also gets reflected sometimes in terms of the actual knowledge which gets into decision making. And there too, when you see the technical knowledge as supreme, so in a health program, when you value that the doctor is kind of sitting on top, whereas everyone else who is kind of either in a para field or who are linked with the people themselves as less valued, this tends to affect the way in which you overall design the project, implement the project, and the kind of value then that participation itself has. And so the third part in terms of balancing the technical and the social is what time is the social brought in. Okay? And often one may see that the technical is present in the project right from the inception, right when key decisions are being made, whereas the social is brought in when it is the time for implementation, or even more than implementation, when a rollout on physical site is about to happen. For example, in a water supply project, okay, all the decisions about how the design, water source, pipelines, everything is made, and now you want to institute a village water committee, which is going to perhaps contribute towards the cost of the taps and the pipelines and is going to take over the maintenance. And it is at that time that you begin to think about the social and the thing of participation. And it may be too late, because people may also begin to question the entire way in which the project itself has been thought of. And that kind of a space needs to be definitely created. We move now to the next aspect of participation. In thinking about participation as a strategy, how do you build capacities for participation? And when we envisage participation as a co-production process, then obviously both organizations which are implementing participatory projects and designing them, as well as people who are participating in these, for both of them these are new experiences, and therefore the entire aspect of capacity building actually emerges, and it's a distinct orientation. Because otherwise these orientations, if we see in multiple models, are very conflictual and usually adversarially pitched. So this is not just a change in attitude, but this is also often involving new knowledges and new skill sets as well. So let's look at first, how do we look at building capacities of project implementers, right? Project implementers are usually resourced organizations. They are also structured hierarchically, and the minute one talks about hierarchy, the concomitant thing is that they are characterized by vertical decision making, and therefore there are gaps in relating to local people. Gaps such as there could be language barrier. Often the kind of languages that you value are going to be English. Even if there is a local language being spoken, that local language would tend to be a very formal language rather than the spoken terms which are being thought of. And one can give examples of how this language barrier can be a very important barrier. Similarly, thinking of non-legal and non-technical language, which project proponents always try to use. Okay? So if you have a housing project, that housing project is always explained in terms of FSIs and built up areas and land use and laws and so on and so forth, whereas people talk in terms of we want this, we want that space, we want to use it in this way. So there is a very different way of relating to issues itself, right? And therefore creating a common language, a common terminology is a very important task of building up this kind of a capacity. So within this, what are the things that we need to also remember? That participation is a dynamic process, and when we say it is a dynamic process, it cannot be shut down like a tap, and therefore it often leads to greater demands than what were envisaged originally. Just to give one example, in Mumbai there was this project called the Slum Upgradation Program, and which provided for creating cooperative housing societies within slums and upgrading the kind of infrastructure that it had. There were particular provisions which were made for the same, and which largely included providing for basic services. Now, in several communities in which this project was attempted to be implemented, the communities actually demanded for building retainer walls, because they were located on hills and they constantly faced the danger of landslides. These communities were confident that basic services like water and sanitation could be provided for them by other funds, and they themselves were confident about these. They were short of these larger infrastructures which could add to their overall security. Now, this was something which was not envisaged by project proponents at all, and this is very likely to happen in most projects, and therefore are we having the spaces to recognize that there could be some of these additional demands? It's very difficult to predict them. The second thing that is very interesting is, and important to remember, is that capacity building for participation needs to be privileged not just at the bottom level, which is often done, but it needs to be privileged right from the top. Do we recognize participation as important? Then that importance needs to come from the top decision making and then filter down right to the bottom. The second part of building up capacities is to look at capacities of communities. Now, communities really are agents in some ways. So, participation involves when communities become actors. They are not just victims of change, but they really become agents who are scripting their own change, and they become partners of that. And what it means then is to restore to communities the agency to act in their own collective interests. Something which is they have ceded, or the way in which the political process has evolved, where the state has taken over the capacity to determine what is development and to implement development projects. Building capacity of community means that they become actors and partners in this process. So for this, then, what is very interesting is how do we give communities those tools, those instruments, and those knowledges by which they can speak to people, they can speak to institutions, they can speak to agencies who are determining their own destiny and the community's destiny. One very interesting example of this is the award-winning work of an organization called SPARK, which stands for Society for Promotion of Area Resource Centers. Now, what SPARK has done is that it has basically enabled communities to self-enumerate. And by self-enumeration, they have enabled slum communities which are very, very invisible within the whole data picture, policy picture of urban areas, to actually emerge as very legitimate actors and who are people with ideas and very pragmatic solutions to problems which are otherwise considered intractable. And therefore, this kind of enumeration becomes a tool. There are other organizations which have experimented with mapping, this very interesting example of how communities along the coast, fishermen communities along the coast, have mapped their coastlines and brought this to the notice of the CRZ authorities, the coastal regulation zones, and have forced them into taking decisions which are also accommodative of the local fish folk interests. So this is a very, very interesting dimension of building capacity. The second, I think, is to also bring in the cautionary note that communities themselves are not homogeneous. They have hierarchy and there is also inequity within communities. So we need to think of capacity building as also a project of building more democratic and more inclusive modes of working and of decision making within the communities. And this really requires significant amount of capacity building. So what does this kind of capacity building involve? It means that A, you have to build confidence in communities. B, confidence that they can relate, because dealing with internal conflict is often much more difficult than dealing with even structural and conflict with external actors. The second is, how do you deal with prejudice? Okay? Because you will find out in communities that there are set ideas about what is it that women can do, how is it that particular groups behave, whether they belong to different religion, sometimes belonging to a different caste group, belonging to a different ethnic group like a tribal group. And it's very difficult to bring this around sometimes. Sometimes these conflicts are articulate, but sometimes these are conflicts and prejudices which are also silent, and therefore one has to build capacity on this over a period of time. I'll come to the final dimension, and this final dimension is really key. From talking about participation in projects, one is now thinking of how does one mainstream participation, how does one institutionalize participation for a larger goal. So what does this institutionalization mean? It means that how do you program participation into an organizational design, into an operational protocol of organizations or societies. Second, it is basically building rhythms and rituals of participation, and which are accessible, familiar, and therefore can be sustained. And finally, institutionalization also implies that participation has to be open to adaptation, and it can creating a space which can actually change over time. So it has to be able to create that, otherwise then participation will only remain projectified. It lives as long as the project is, and post the project there is no life, afterlife to participation at all. Now, having talked about institutionalization, I mean this is all that it involves, but often it is very, very difficult to institutionalize. So what are the different ways and debates around institutionalizing participation? One of the ways in which this has been thought of is to create a space for participation in through forums of different kinds. Okay, I'll again try to give examples here and think about how do we think through creation of forums. So one is really creating spaces, social spaces, and legitimating them through an operational or an institutional protocol. I think one of the most classic cases here of creating such a social space, a participatory space, is that of a Gram Sabha, which has now been institutionalized through all the Panchayati Raj Acts post the 73rd Amendment, and this Gram Sabha has also been given a certain legitimacy through the when it should be conducted, who conducts it, what should be done, and so on and so forth. Okay, but it can happen that you create participatory forums, but at the same time the way you mobilize, the way you generate other practices of participation are not oriented towards genuine participation. So therefore you will see in the case of a lot of Gram Sabhas that these are organized really as ritualistic exercises. So the 15th August, the Independence Day celebration, or the 26th January celebration, mask for village assemblies. So which is really something where you create a forum, but then you waste away that forum because your mobilizational practice is not something which is in sync with this larger spirit of participation. The second is in terms of what should be the nature of a forum. And one of the classic examples linked to this is in the 1980s, as many governments and NGOs started adopting participation as a key strategy, a very frequent experience was that you would see multiple forums for participation in a village. So there would be joint forest management committees, there would be drinking water committees, NGOs would start, or the Gram Panchayat would start an education forum, then there were watershed management forums, and all of these multiple forums existing separate from another locally elected Gram Panchayat. Okay? And none of these would link to the Gram Panchayat in any way, and there were these multiple forums which actually create a divisiveness of their own. And therefore, the formation of a forum has to be preceded by a very careful thought to the nature, to its representativeness, and most importantly to the dynamism of existing forums. What are the pre-existing forums of participation? Is there a need for a separate forum, or should we is any of the existing forums, one could use that, one could develop that in a different way. So this is something that one needs to really think through. The second aspect, other than building forums, is now moving to you build institutions. Now building of institutions is very significant for the afterlife of participation, because it basically sustains that participation. So this is important from the point of view of the afterlife of that participatory effort. And it can take multiple legal and associational forms. So it can be a cooperative, it can be an association, a union, a society, a company. So it can be multiple things. But sustaining an institution is not just forming a legal space. It involves adequate preparation in terms of the managerial and the strategic capacities. It also requires a very careful thinking through of what are the financial and physical resources which are available to this potential institution, and a commitment to shared goals and values. Okay? Because often what happens is, you form institutions, you assume that these institutions are going to sustain the effort, but these institutions then are very incapable of sustaining themselves, and they get caught up within their own logic, their own competition, and we need to recognize this. We finally get into another aspect of institutionalization, which is mainstreaming. And mainstreaming involves another dimension, which is scaling up and sustaining. And what this means is that the participatory process which has been initiated has to become a part of the operational fabric of the institution. So one of the key things and main principles really of mainstreaming is that it cannot be a last minute thought, that you are coming to the final phase of the project and then you are beginning to think about how to mainstream it. It has to be part of a planned strategy right from the beginning. And finally, it requires an organizational commitment to the idea of participation, and how modes of participation need to be a part of the organizational protocols. A very interesting example here is that the Commissioner of Pune in 2010 initiated a participatory budgeting process. Now this was an individual's initiative, a leader's initiative, but this leader took care to see that he collaborated with a NGO, a Center for Environment Education in Pune, and they created the space in such a way that it facilitated the creation of formats, that there was a whole lot of citizenship education and other stakeholder education, like the municipal councillors, several other corporates. All of these stakeholders were educated on how the budgetary process would actually take place, and this helped citizens to articulate their own demands into projects, which was a significant amount of capacity building. Because one can make demands, I want this, I want that, but to move beyond that, to articulate it into saying, for this demand there is this project requires so much money, and the way it would be mainstream, this really requires some thinking through. So this is a very, very interesting example of a mainstreaming of participation, and which often is bypassed, which is often not thought through, more because it is not thought of at the initial stage. And this cannot be a last minute knee-jerk kind of a thought that now participation needs to be mainstream. So finally, we need to think that and recognize that what is participation, that dynamism, unpredictability, unevenness are hallmarks of a participatory process. You cannot have participation process does not mean that right from beginning to end you have a few thousand people always participating in the process. It may start as a trickle. There are points at which it may have thousands of people. There may be others where people are not participating and it's so turbulent that there are conflicts constantly, and there may be other points where it is going very, very smooth. People are committed, all participating in particular project. So we need to understand that these are really hallmarks of a participatory process, and this needs to be accepted. What is important is that community organizers need to have faith in the potential of participation, and they need to constantly and creatively think of ways and means by which the level of and depth of participation can be gauged, and then how it can be enhanced and institutionalized. At the same time, recognizing that the position and the location of the organizer within the project itself is very critical in affording the space that it requires for these kind of decisions. You can refer the text for this for many further references. Thank you.